Hey everyone, this is Scott from SertMedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be going over just GTmetrix in general. I'm going to be going down each of the sections explaining what you need to do for each rules, and before most of you freak out, that fully loaded time is higher on purpose. I did it on purpose to illustrate a topic for this video, so do not worry. So we're going to go through each of the metrics. I'm going to explain what they mean, whether they actually matter, and how you would go about solving them. Because GTmetrix is a little bit outdated. They are working on pivoting it to use like a variation of Lighthouse data, but we're going to just jump in and we're going to explain it. So the page speed score uses an older version of the Google Page Speed Suggestions tool. And some of these suggestions are actively used and other ones not so much. They're basically just a list of best practices for your website. As you can see, I got a 99 and a 95. So the first warning you probably get is leverage browser caching. Leverage browser caching is a suggestion where you add caching headers to the resource on your server and you serve them to the user. That way the user doesn't have to re-download a script or an image multiple times on every page visit. So as you can see, it's being flagged for Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. I'm not sure why I have Google Tag Manager. I probably was messing around with something, but either way, these are not fixable. I could try to host the script locally. The disadvantage of that, though, is it can have issues with it updating, and you can't always do it for every script. Some third-party scripts will appear in here, and you just won't be able to host them locally. You see this often with live chat scripts and sharing services in particular, like add this or share this, where the resources change very frequently. So this warning should be fixable to any resource from your server. If you're a Cloudflare user, you may have a CDN-CGI email protection warning, and that is completely normal. That's because it contains the actual code to decode the email that it is obfuscated to prevent it from being scraped. This is a good warning and you should pay attention to it, but for third-party assets, don't worry about it. Minified JavaScript. This is a good warning. If you notice you have a very large amount of JavaScript, so as you can see, it says I can save 119 bytes off of a merged JS file and 56 bytes from another. Those don't really matter. But if you have a very large file and it says you could save something like 50 kilobytes, that's a point of alarm. You should be able to resolve that and get that number down. You can use things like Cloudflare or WordPress Rocket or auto-optimize to compress your scripts, and that'll make the warning go away. This is important and you should pay attention to it. Minified CSS is, again, just like the JavaScript one. You compress your CSS. For WordPress users, obviously, you can just go ahead and use a plugin. Auto-optimize, once again, will do it. You compress the resources, you remove the white space, and you remove the comments in them. It says that this could save 222 bytes. I'm not really sure where it's going to save those bytes. And what's great about GTmetrix, though, is that it will provide you a suggested file that it says this is roughly what your optimized file would look like. I'm not seeing any difference. So maybe there is one, maybe there isn't, but at 222 bytes, that's nothing. And it's suggested for the Google fonts. In the Google fonts, you're almost always going to get flagged for because there is white space in these scripts. And as you can see, mine are very long and complicated with a very long kit attribute after it, so that's probably not helping. The specify a char set early, basically as it mentions here, the following resources have no character set specified in the HTTP request. Specifying a character set in the HTTP request can speed up the browser rendering. This is a minor issue. Like it says that I could resolve for my ionicons.waf.2, and I'm not particularly worried about it. Most of the time it doesn't really matter. Avoid bad requests. Basically, this warning just says, hey, you have a 404 error on your page, and it's probably you try to connect to a JavaScript file that doesn't exist, or a CSS file, or the most common one is an image, and the image does not exist. The reason that a 404 or a bad request is bad is typically because, at least particularly on WordPress websites, a 404 page is typically uncached. Very few hosts and plugins will cache 404 pages because it can lead to issues. There's one notable exception. Kinsta does cache the 404 pages, but I believe it's only for 15 minutes. But having a 404 request is bad because if you connect to a JS resource that doesn't exist, instead of downloading that resource, you're actually going to be downloading the 404 HTML. So that HTML is now being downloaded. So if you had a 10 kilobyte image, or that's what it was, and you deleted it. And now at 404s, you could be downloading 50 kilobytes of HTML from the 404 page. So it's always good to resolve 404 errors, and it can also cause a hindrance when the user's just trying to download and render the page if there's a lot of them, because now it's going to be checking these URLs and it's going to be getting a 404 response repeatedly, and there can be a noticeable impact on the render performance, especially on desktops. You notice it a lot more on there in particular. Avoid landing page redirects. If you test the incorrect URL, you're always going to get this warning. What this warning says is you have a landing page redirect. So if I went to http://www.certmedia.com, I would get redirected to the HTTPS version. The only way you'll ever resolve that warning is just to test the correct URL. Otherwise, it'll constantly flag you. So just make sure that you test the correct URL. The reason that it doesn't so much matter that you test the HTTP version over the HTTPS version is ultimately because of two things. Number one, if you have HSTS preloading, the browser will remember that your site is over HTTPS and it won't need to handle that redirect. And number two, most of your users tend to come from search engines or like Facebook. So they have a direct link, and that link is almost always going to be the correct protocol for your website, especially when it comes to Google. Defer parsing of JavaScript. This means that the JavaScript either includes an async or a defer tag. If you're a Cloudflare user, this is where the rocket loader will come in. It will also clear this warning because it will make the JS non-render blocking. We've done videos on async JavaScript, WordPress Rocket, Auto Optimize. Basically, any of the large plugins will clear this warning for you. Just remember that not always there's situations when the JavaScript can't be deferred without using something like Cloudflare's rocket loader. The reason for that is, especially with larger themes, Divi, I think, has a dependency on jQuery being in the header. But basically, you have an inline script that will be dependent on a script being render blocking. So commonly, jQuery in WordPress is render blocking. That's why Auto Optimize excludes it by default. So this warning should be clearable for most of your JavaScript files, especially if you're combining them anyways using something like Auto Optimize or WordPress Rocket. But if all else fails, if you're using Cloudflare, you can enable the rocket loader and this will clear that warning. Enable compression is just basically a check that says, hey, are you using gzip or are you using Brotli? Every resource, or at least text-based resources and SVGs, should be compressed with gzip or Brotli. This will greatly reduce the file size, at least the transfer size of that file. The easiest way to illustrate this is right here, I have my main CSS file. It is 27.5 kilobytes. That's the compressed size. So that's the size of the file that's sent down the wire. But the uncompressed size is 183.5 kilobytes. So it's about more or less, a little bit more on the lesser side, but it's about 1/6 of the weight as it would be without gzip compression. And most caching plugins will add this for you automatically. Cloudflare will even upgrade you to Brotli compression. So you shouldn't have too much of a trouble fixing this. Just to make sure if you have a page caching plugin installed that it's adding the rules. And most good hosts now will also add these for you by default. WordPress Engine Kinsta, I think, adds it by default now. And a lot of the managed hosts will automatically add recommended ones. Or you can use Cloudflare as well to specify it for all files. Keep alive headers are typically, they're enabled on your hosts, and you could go over here and get a long technical explanation. And as it mentions, you could explicitly turn it on by adding this line into your HTTP configuration file. Most of you are going to have no idea what that means. Basically, you just add this line into the Apache configuration file, which you're probably not going to touch, and it will essentially, it allows a connection effectively to stay open. So as it mentions, the HTTP persistent connections will allow the TCP connections to send and receive multiple HTTP requests. So it reduces latency. I think Cloudflare will resolve this for you as well. Do not quote me on it, but it should be relatively simple. If you're on any decent web host, even the lower end hosts like GoDaddy, Bluehost, and HostGator will add this. The only times I see a host that doesn't support this is if they're really like a one-off $3 a month host and you're honestly getting what you pay for there. And if you're on a shared host, you will not be able to resolve this. You cannot just add a line to your htaccess file. It has to be enabled at the Apache level. And you're not going to be able to resolve it. Inlining small CSS. You really shouldn't inline small CSS. The problem with inlining small CSS is it's always better to add it in a file. So let's say you have some plugins installed and they have a very small CSS. We did a video on the scriptless social share and it had like a couple kilobyte size of a CSS file. That would get flagged on this warning. Instead of inlining it, which would be quite silly, it's better to merge it using something like auto-optimize, which sounds a bit counterintuitive because HTTP2, it's typically better, or it's supposed to be better, to just split your files so that we gain the benefit of the browser caching. But it's never better to inline the CSS files, and honestly, you should just merge all the files together. When you inline the small CSS, it no longer becomes cacheable, and that is kind of the exact opposite of what you would desire. The exact same thing for inline small JavaScript. You're better just merging them into a single file, so long as it's tamed. If you have 400 kilobytes of compressed JavaScript or CSS, you're still going to have major performance issues, but you'll have less than if you had just left them split. And oftentimes, even with Lighthouse, you do see a performance improvement with very large CSS and very large JavaScript files, which even in HTTP2 environments sounds counterintuitive, but I see it time and time again when testing websites where even if the files are just minified and they're smaller, you still gain that initial benefit. And that kind of makes sense, but it's just something to keep in mind. Minimize redirects. This is a very simple warning. This warning will come up if a resource is redirecting to another URL. If you've ever used short pixel adaptive images and you didn't have a license, the images will redirect back to your host. This is exactly that. Your resources shouldn't redirect to another resource if you can help it. If it's a third-party resource, you're not going to be able to resolve this. A lot of the GTmetrix warnings you will not be able to resolve if they're on a third-party server, so keep this in mind. Optimize images. You can go ahead and install something like UImage Optimizer, Robin Image Optimizer, and have it losslessly compress your images. And that will clear this warning. You do not need lossy compression to clear this warning or to clear the warning in Lighthouse. We're going to pivot right back because I skipped this one. Minimize request size. This, as it mentions here, is keeping cookies and request headers as small as possible, ensures that an HTTP request can fit in a single packet. I only see this warning on sites that have an astronomically large amount of Google fonts where it's literally like a paragraph in the URL size. Your solution to that is not having resources with either very large cookies, which isn't normally a concern, or very large URLs, which in the case of Google fonts, if you're getting flagged for this warning in particular due to your amount of Google fonts, you're probably using too many. That is the honest truth. You're probably using way too many Google fonts for your page, and that's a bigger issue. This is definitely not something, though, that I would lose sleep about. It's not going to make that big of a deal, so long as it's not a common reoccurrence for your website. So just make sure you're not serving very large cookies, or your URL structure is not completely absurd and goes on for what feels like paragraphs instead of a concise 1, maybe 2-line long file URL. Put the CSS in the document head. Nobody should fail this warning, but basically it just says, you put your CSS in the header and your JavaScript in the footer, ideally, except for jQuery, which will probably be in the header. Serve resources from a consistent URL. This is a warning that typically happens when you have something like Font Awesome on your website or images. So basically you have two resources that are coming from two different URLs that have the exact same content. So multiple plugins in WordPress will load like Font Awesome, and they'll load version 4.7.0. And another plugin will load it. Even though it's the exact same resource, because it's being served from two separate URLs, it will be downloaded twice. Now, while you could just combine them into one large file and that would clear the warning, it's also important and better if you just dequeue or use something like perf matters to disable those resources from loading in the first place. In the case for images, go ahead and find the images if you can and manually replace them. If they're very large images, especially, if it's something like a 10 kilobyte image and you're using them and serving them as WebP and they come from a CDN and you just can't find it, don't lose sleep about it. It's just about saving like 10 kilobytes. But you really should try to fix it if you can, but I wouldn't drive yourself crazy over it. Serving scaled images basically just means you're resizing your images to fit the container size that they're in. So on this image, I have its dimensions at 1920 by 1080, and its intrinsic value is 1903. Basically, if you open up this image real quick, the total thing has a 1920 by 1080 resolution. The actual image is 1903. So if I wanted to resize this image, and if it was a 4K resolution image over here, I'd want to set the width to be 1920. And the height attribute doesn't matter so much. It's really just the width attribute matching. But you go ahead and you find images, you resize them to the appropriate size that it suggests. If you want to keep the images looking a little bit sharper, you can increase it. So let's say it suggests that you have an image of, I'm not even going to try and guess what the height attribute would be. So let's just say it's like 250 as your width. If you wanted to bump it up to like 300 to get a little bit of a sharper image, you can do that and it will not flag you. But you really should try to resize it for the container size that you're working with. Specifying a cache validator. So as it kind of mentions over here, you either have a last modified or an e tag header, so that allows the browser to take full advantage of the benefits of caching. It kind of just goes back to the browser caching headers that most of your plugins will add. It basically just tells the browser that it can cache the resource and when the last time it may have been modified. Avoid CSS at imports. This is a good thing to do, even though that they mentioned the reasoning for being like Internet Explorer or something. They actually changed their warning. That's awesome on their side. Basically, if you have like a CSS style sheet and you're using at import, it is less efficient than if you were to just copy the contents of that file and paste it into the same file. So I commonly see this on sites in particular that use fonts. If you at import a Google font, for instance, that's going to be less efficient than just sticking it in your header. And it's because it breaks the parallel aspect of HTTP2. So what happens is to the browser is it goes to your CSS file and it scans it and it says, oh, there's 2, maybe 3 at import requests in here. The browser then needs to make a separate request to fetch those files as well. This is just obviously less efficient than if they were all loaded as separate files or just the contents were pasted into a single file. So try to avoid at import in your theme building. There are certain plugins in WordPress that will do this and you cannot get around it. And honestly, it's quite annoying and I wish that they didn't do it. The one that I can think of is Pop-Up Maker. They at imports their Google fonts into the main style sheet for their plugin. I don't know why they do it that way, but they will use an at import request for that Google font. And that's especially troublesome because you're not then able to modify it using something like WordPress Rocket, which will add font display swap, or you're not able to use something like auto optimize if you wanted to try the web font loader. So using at import is just not recommended. There are some caching plugins that will try to process the request for you. W3 Total Cache does. It has a process request, which basically means that it will check your CSS files. If it runs into an at import, it will follow the file, it will download its contents and input it into the final file when it's minified or whether it is combined. And that's a really strong feature. I wish more plugins did it, but they don't. I don't know why. I do not know why they don't bother fixing a very fixable issue, but that's their choice. Prefer asynchronous resources. You probably will never be flagged for this warning. Basically, you have something that's a common script like Facebook Pixel, and you're loading it in a synchronous fashion instead of using the async version of it when it's readily available. Yes, pretty much every third-party resource should be loaded asynchronously, and the easiest thing to do is honestly just go back to the provider. Facebook Pixel in particular, you can just go copy the exact same code, and it adds basically one little line, and it loads it as asynchronous. If you ever get told by your marketer that it should be synchronous for their tracking or analytics, that's just silly. That's just silly. Everybody's been using asynchronous for years now, and there hasn't been any major issues with tracking. Google Analytics is asynchronous. Everything is asynchronous now, so you should be using the asynchronous version of your resource if it exists. Specifying image dimensions is a bit of a tricky bit of a tricky business. So this warning can come up even if your images are not necessarily including their image height. So right here, these images are very grainy, but ignoring their graininess, I have the width and the height attributes declared. And that's basically what this warning does. When you declare the image width and height, it will allow the browser to read the HTML, and it's like, okay, well, I need to set the container size for something around here. Now, the problem with this is we have CSS now, and CSS pretty much allows you to set the size to whatever you want, and it's fluid. You can get falsely flagged for this because it doesn't check your CSS to determine if you're declaring the size in there. So for instance, the image height and width on this is technically set to 300 by 200, but we can see that the actual dimension is 582 by 388. So I'm using a very small image in here when I shouldn't be. But more importantly, I know that those height attributes mean nothing because they're incorrect and it's being overwritten by the CSS. Most images in WordPress will automatically add the attributes on by themselves because most theme developers are following standard WordPress procedure, and it will automatically include the attributes of the actual image height and width. So you shouldn't need to worry about this. You'll notice this in one-off themes, or if you're adding an image in a widget in particular, where the height and width attributes are not included, but this will not bring you that much of a performance boost from using it from not having them. It just won't matter all that much. And then it tells you to avoid a character set in the meta tag. Almost nobody's going to get flagged for this. That's why it's always at the bottom. But basically it says specifying my character in the meta tag disables the look ahead downloader IE8. To improve the resource, move the character set to the HTTP2 content response header. I've never seen a website flagged for this, so I'm not even going to touch on it. YSlow, we're going to go through this a little bit faster though, because a lot of these are very redundant. Expires headers was the exact same thing as the browser caching headers. They have code that they recommend that you add, but most of your caching plugins will add this for you automatically. As you can see, both the items that I get flagged for are third party, the Rocket Letter from Cloudflare, and the Google fonts. Use cookie-free domains. I actually did an entire video on how you cannot fix this if you're using Cloudflare, and that it doesn't really matter. Even if you removed all your cookies, I wouldn't even see 1 kilobyte lost in page size, so you shouldn't care about this warning. Reducing DNS lookups. So basically, back in the day, when HTTP2 didn't exist, having a large number of DNS lookups, as it mentions here, will add delay to the initial request to a host. Making the request to a large number of different hosts can hurt performance. They're right and wrong kind of at the same time. Using a lot of DNS lookups to third parties is typically an indication of poor performance. If you use ads on your website, AdSense, Mediavine, whatever you're using, you'll have a ton of these, and you can't and you kind of have to ignore it because your only recourse for resolving the warning is to remove the resource. This is not a check to see if you're using a DNS prefetch header. This is a check that says you're using too many third-party resources because there's too many DNS lookup requests. In the world of HTTP2, having a lot of DNS lookup requests isn't that big of a concern from a direct performance standpoint, but if you have a lot of DNS lookups, you're probably using a lot of different third parties, and that's typically an indication that your performance is going to be pretty bad because third-party resources, as I always stress on this channel, are typically the biggest cause of a slowdown on a WordPress website in particular. Make fewer HTTP requests. This is a couple of warnings all combined into one. Number one, it'll say you have too many CSS files. As I mentioned, you can combine them into one and that will resolve it. Combining JavaScript files will clear the JavaScript warning. The third one is if you have background images and it wants you to use a CSS spray. For most themes, this is not fixable unless you had a child theme and you rewrote the CSS, and it's honestly more trouble than it's worth. I would not bother resolving that warning for the CSS for background images. It's just going to cost you too much time. Serving them as WebP will be more than sufficient for actual real-world performance. There is a slight performance advantage to using WebP images, though. In the same area of combining your JavaScript files, when you have a lot of images as one image and you're using CSS sprites, they will have a smaller payload because they benefit from better compression because it's one larger file. However, again, most of the time you can't fix it. I think Soliloquy, the slider plugin, gets flagged for this quite often. Maybe. I believe it is Soliloquy that will get flagged for this, but you can just safely ignore it. If you want to use CSS sprites, there are online tools that will do it, but frankly, you shouldn't bother unless you're building the site from scratch. And if you are, you're probably trying to use SVG sprites, but really I wouldn't bother too much with it. Compressed components is, again, adding your gzip headers. Using a content delivery network, basically using something like Cloudflare. Cloudflare is what I use on all my websites and client websites. It's great. It's free. Has a great pro plan too. Never had any complaints with it. I've used it for a very long time. Minified JavaScript and CSS, exact same warning from the other page. Avoid URL redirects, same thing from the other page. Make your AJAX request cacheable. This is by default if you have caching headers. Remove duplicate JavaScript and CSS. If you have two files that have, as I mentioned here, if you have two files from two different URLs, like on that home page, like on the page speed warning, serving the exact same resource, you'll get flagged from here, but you'll almost never get flagged for this. Avoid alpha image loader. I can't think of the last time I saw a website actually using this. But as I mentioned here, don't use it because it blocks the rendering and increases page load times. I've never seen it used on a WordPress website yet, so I would say it's safe to ignore it. Avoid HTTP requests. So this is the exact same thing of avoiding a bad request. Reduce DOM elements. This is also a warning that's present in Lighthouse. When you have too many DOM elements, it means you have too many elements on the page. There are only two ways to fix this. Number one, you can remove the elements, or number two, you can write better code. If you're using something like Elementor and you're building a very large, complicated page, you're going to get flagged for this. I believe it is set to 2000 is when anything over 2000 you get flagged on here. It might be a little bit higher, but DOM elements are essentially any real element on your page. This is a DOM element. This is a DOM element. You're going to get a lot of DOM elements, particularly if you're using sliders or carousels, because they have a lot of, frankly, HTML and markup, and then that tends to be quite complex. Another one that I see that gets flagged quite often is mega menus. If you have mega menus that when you hover and it gives you like posts from a category and you have a drop down with a bunch of other posts from over there, those tend to be very complicated as well. Your only real recourse from this is to just remove the elements, because unless you're building the site from scratch, and if you have the technical know-how to do that, you're going to be already aware of how to fix this issue. But the easiest way is to remove complex resources. Avoid using sliders if you can. Avoid using carousels if you can. That's going to get you flagged the most. Using get for AJAX requests, that's normal and standard. You shouldn't get flagged for this. Avoid CSS expressions. I've never seen a site flagged for this, so I would probably say you could just ignore it. As I mentioned here, you can produce thousands, expressions can produce thousands of unnecessary CSS evaluations. CSS variables are now pretty common, and that's not going to get you flagged for this, but it will reduce your file size. Avada uses CSS variables, which is kind of along the same line. Reduce cookie size. I've never seen a site that had very large cookies, quite frankly. But if you are issuing a cookie and the size and the content of the value of that cookie is too large, you can get flagged for it, because serving a very large cookie does add to the file size and it does add to that initial download. But if you're using something like Cloudflare and WordPress, you'll never see this warning come up. Make your favicon small and cacheable. Yes, your favicon should be very small and cacheable, because if you have a very large favicon file, it's obviously going to be much slower to download. And if it's much slower to download, it's just going to be a hindrance for your users. And it's going to take longer for that awesome little icon to show up here. Then it feels like everybody forgets because I have dark mode. And there is a way to fix that, but I just don't. Configure entity tags, e-tags. Again, this goes back to that browser caching suggestion, as I mentioned here. You can running multiple servers with the default e-tag can prevent 304 responses. You'll never get flagged for this. And it mentions making JavaScript and CSS external. Having inline CSS and inline JS means that it's not cacheable. You will never get flagged for this because it is disabled from the score calculations. Now we're going to talk about what the YSlow Score and the page speed score is. As I touched in the beginning, page speed score is an old school metric from the older versions of Google's page speed API, and YSlow used to be based off of the Yahoo speed test that no longer exists. So they're just a combined score from two different metrics that come together and they combine it. You will not necessarily get 100 on the page speed score and a 100 on the YSlow score. If you want 100 on the YSlow score, for instance, you cannot use Cloudflare, or you have to serve your resources from another CDN. But as I covered, and that's because of the cookie-free domains warning, it doesn't really matter. The scores are a little bit arbitrary and they're a bit useless. I wouldn't really bother with them too much, in all honesty. If you're getting good performance, and if you're in the 90 range on the page speed score, that's pretty indicative of a well-optimized page. But the YSlow score, honestly, if you have any third parties, as it mentions here, the average YSlow score is a 76, and the average page speed score is a 74. Now, your fully loaded time is a metric that people get quite confused about. As I mentioned here, the average fully loaded time is 7.1 seconds. And there is a misconception of what the fully loaded time means and how it relates to your page's performance, and we're going to have to address it. So fully loaded time is the total amount of time it takes for your browser to download all the resources on your page and to have 2 seconds of no network activity. So on this test that I ran and artificially slowed down something, the fully loaded time was 3.7 seconds. That means it took 3.7 seconds for my website to have 2 seconds of no network activity. So basically, the test got to 3.7 seconds. It waited 2 seconds afterwards, and there was nothing in there. So the test concluded and said the fully loaded time was 3.7. This in particular can be artificially inflated if you're using a third-party resource, especially complicated ones such as chat widgets. If you're using something like Intercom, Drift, anything like that, and some tracking scripts, notably Hotjar. I don't know why Hotjar always gets, well, I do know why, but Hotjar always gets flagged on here. They will artificially inflate the fully loaded time. So you'll see users like, oh, you have a 255 kilobyte website, but it takes 4 seconds for it to download. That's really slow. But it doesn't take 3 seconds for the website to be done. It doesn't take 3 seconds for it to be interactive. And that's kind of the problem of measuring with fully loaded time, is it's not a good indication of when your website is actually accessible and usable. And this can change run to run, because if you use something like Hotjar, Hotjar has to go and download the resource from their server. It will also ping your browser a couple of times just to track that activity, because Hotjar is primarily used for heat mapping. And those extra pings, if you have one every 1.5 seconds, your waterfall could look kind of something like this. So as you can see, my last image, and these are lazy loaded images, they were downloaded at 1.45 seconds. That's what the request start time since the beginning means, of 1.45 seconds. Right over here, this one was at 1.67 seconds. And all the way over here in this white space is Google Tag Manager. Now, this is likely because I have the rocket loader and I kind of overly inflated it. But for a normal website, this is actually not that far-fetched. There are times when you'll have a huge gap in your timeline, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because resources will not always be downloaded right away. So as you can see kind of up here, you'll see that I have this stats.wp.com. That is the Jetpack stats. It is downloaded right here at 748 milliseconds. But it also sends a request to pixel.wordpress.com all the way down here at 3.63 seconds. Now, somebody who doesn't know how to read waterfalls would tell you, well, it takes 3 seconds for your website to load. But in actuality, all the content of my website is done kind of around here. And this is the onload event time. That's what this red indication means. So, but a little bit further back, my green warning, and green is under here. This is my contentful paint time. And my blue is my DOM content loaded. So my whole HTML document is downloaded at 0.7 seconds. And the first, in the contentful paint time and the first contentful paint time, it looks like, are both at 0.8 seconds. And the onload event time triggers at 1 second. So no, even though I've artificially inflated the fully loaded time, the website doesn't take 3 seconds to download. And as you can see here, it mentions the onload event time was 1.05 seconds. And the onload event time typically is a good indication of when, as it mentions here, it occurs when the processing of the page and all the resources on the page, images, etc., have downloaded. This is also the same time that the DOM complete occurs and the JavaScript on the onload event fires. So that is a lot of jargon, but basically this means at the onload event time, so in this case it was 1 second, all of my images, my HTML, and my CSS were completely downloaded and rendered, it looks like, based on the contentful paint time, as well as the DOM loader time. So then on that time is when the onload event fires. That's when JavaScript that's deferred will also execute. So it could take a little bit after this for the page to be rendered and to be usable. If you had like a slider, for instance, your slider may not be ready at one. If I had a slider up here, for instance, say it was like Revolution slider, even though I dislike that plugin with a passion. Let's say I had Revolution slider up here. Now what's going to happen is after that 1 second, the onload event time, that is when, because it's deferred via the rocket loader and it's loaded asynchronously, that is when the scripts for Rev Slider will begin to be executed. And that's when the Rev Slider would actually load in. But at that 1 second interval, we can now assume, well, the HTML and the CSS are fully rendered. So the page is more or less going to be interactive at this point. And if you're curious of what happens, we're going to go ahead and click on our network tab here. And you can actually measure this timing in the browser. So if you reload this, so the DOM content was loaded for me at 961 milliseconds. The load event, which is the fully loaded event, the finish was the fully loaded event at 1.8 seconds, and the onload event time was 1.33 seconds. That's pretty quick. Ran it again, so that way the page was in the Cloudflare cache, and it was 634 milliseconds for the onload event time. The DOM loaded content was 270 milliseconds, and the finish event was 908 milliseconds. Now, if you're curious as to why I don't get the 3 seconds fully loaded time, is because I excluded my own user agent, because I do not want to make it any more complicated and require editing, as much editing as needed. So basically, the fully loaded time is a indication of when your page is going to be fully done. I'm going to pull up I'm going to put in a random website. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to go to Amazon. So I want to run Amazon through GTmetrix real quick. Amazon.com. And Amazon's probably going to have a pretty decent overall load time, but it's going to have likely a little bit on the slower end fully loaded time. So just because you have a high fully loaded time doesn't mean it's taking 4 seconds for your users to necessarily be able to access and use your page. So let's see what it flags it at. Fully load time is 6.7 seconds and had 417 requests. And you might be thinking, wow, this is terrible. But now we can go back to our timing intervals and see, well, the onload event time was at 3.5 seconds, but the page was painted at 0.7 seconds. The contentful paint event was at least fired. So something defined in the DOM was painted. So that's a pretty decent paint time. And the DOM interactive time, which the browser has finished loading and parsing the HTML, has been built, was at 2.3 seconds. That's not all that slow for a large site like Amazon. Go back to my website though, and it was 0.8 seconds. So the moral of the story here is GTmetrix uses the fully loaded time. The fully loaded time is not always indicative of how long it takes your page to be rendered and to be useful to the user. The fully loaded time can be inflated by tracking scripts in particular and by using chat widgets, advertisements, and the easiest way to tell is you can actually block a resource if you're logged into GTmetrix and refuse to allow it to be run. So when I mentioned we're going to go ahead and block this Google Tag Manager. When I mentioned that I had artificially inflated it, it's so that way I could explain this feature. So I can block the URL. So anything from now googletagmanager.com will be blocked. It will not be able to be run and it will be ignored on the test. And I'm also going to do the same thing to the Jetpack stats. And you might be wondering why I don't do it with Cloudflare with Google Fonts, and it's because I do not want to. And if I did it with the Cloudflare Rocket Loader, it would break the test. So here we go, stats.wordpress.com and Google Tag Manager will be blocked on this rerun. And they're both very lightweight scripts, and they're both actually very efficient. As you can see here, the script size for stats.wordpress.com is 3 kilobytes, and the Google Tag Manager was 3.26 kilobytes. Well, 32.6 kilobytes. Either way, they're very small scripts overall. And as you can see, 3.1 second, and all the way out here, it was trying to download the Google Tag Manager script. All the way out here is where Google Tag Manager lived, and right here was the very last image that I had to download. And sometimes when you run this, depending on your site, it will not show the resource at all. If you choose to do an allow list, you can get slightly better results, but it's also a lot more tedious. But if you do the only allow URL, you can whitelist your website, Google Fonts, and the Rocket Loader and rerun it, and it will not measure the impact of those scripts at all. But as you can see, the inclusion of those scripts cost me 1% on YSlow and 1% on page speed, but they're both essential, and they cost me about, what was it? 54 kilobytes of page size in 2 requests. So, GTmetrix, it's a great test. I use it every day. I use it multiple times a day. There's just a lot in it, and you have to be careful with this. The Google Tag Manager, real quick, may actually be from how I'm loading it on purpose. But moral of the story, as I was trying to say, GTmetrix is great. You just have to know how to use it. If just because a website has a high fully loaded time is not necessarily an indication of a problem. If a script, particularly a third-party script, downloads very slowly at the end because it's loaded asynchronously or it's on a delay loading, like I purposely caused on Google Tag Manager and on the stats script, it can artificially inflate your load time. So you have to test multiple times. You have to understand how to use the timings tab, which you only get if you're logged in. Create a GTmetrix account. It's free. Use that. You'll get a lot more useful information. And that's how you can begin to properly use the tool to measure your performance. Now, I've kind of gone over PageSpeed Insights before version 6. So if you wanted to watch those videos, you can. They're on the channel homepage. And that will go over PageSpeed Insights. But using PageSpeed Insights, using Pingdom, and using GTmetrix together, it's how you can get a complete profile of your website's performance to understand where your pitfalls are and if you have an actual problem. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. I will try to help you out the best I can. Otherwise, make sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.